The walls were built to keep the world's most dangerous men inside. Massive stone barriers, steel gates, armed guards. Escape was supposed to be impossible. Yet one man walked out of Britain's most secure prison, vanished into the countryside, and triggered one of the largest manhunts in British history. His name was George Blake, a British intelligence officer who became one of the Soviet Union's most valuable spies. His escape wasn't just a prison break. It was a Cold War operation that embarrassed the British government and stunned intelligence agencies around the world. The story begins in the tense atmosphere of the Cold War. Europe had been divided by ideology after the Second World War, and intelligence services became as powerful as armies. George Blake was born in Rotterdam in 1922 and eventually joined Britain's secret intelligence service, better known as MI6. Intelligent, multilingual, and deeply trusted, Blake quickly rose through the ranks, serving in Europe and later in Asia. Everything changed during the Korean War. Captured by North Korean forces in 1950, Blake spent nearly 3 years as a prisoner. During his captivity, he underwent a dramatic ideological transformation. Rather than breaking under pressure, he embraced communism, believing that the Soviet Union offered a more just vision of the world than the Western powers. When he was finally released and returned to Britain, no one suspected that he had secretly pledged himself to Moscow. Back inside MI6, Blake resumed his work with access to some of Britain's most sensitive operations. But every classified document he handled became a potential gift to Soviet intelligence. For years, he secretly passed thousands of highly classified files to his Soviet handlers, exposing agents, compromising covert missions, and revealing Western espionage techniques across Europe. One of the most devastating betrayals involved the Berlin Tunnel operation. British and American intelligence had secretly constructed a tunnel beneath East Berlin to tap Soviet military communications. It was one of the most ambitious espionage projects of the Cold War. Blake informed the KGB before construction was even complete. Rather than exposing the tunnel immediately, Soviet leaders allowed it to continue operating so they could protect Blake's identity. The West believed it had scored an intelligence triumph, while the Soviets quietly watched the entire operation unfold. For nearly a decade, Blake remained undetected. His reports reached Moscow with astonishing consistency, and many Western agents operating behind the Iron Curtain disappeared after their identities were compromised. Historians still debate exactly how many lives were affected by his betrayal, but the damage to Western intelligence was enormous. His luck finally ran out in 1961. A Polish intelligence officer defected to the West and identified Blake as a Soviet mole. British investigators carefully assembled the evidence before confronting him. Faced with overwhelming proof, Blake confessed. The British courts responded with unprecedented severity. Blake received a prison sentence totaling 42 years, the longest sentence ever imposed by a British court at that time for espionage. Officials hoped the extraordinary punishment would deter future spies and ensure Blake could never again threaten national security. He was transferred to Wormwood Scrubs Prison in London, regarded as one of Britain's most secure prisons. Thick walls, constant surveillance, locked corridors, and disciplined routines made escape seem virtually impossible. Guards believed Blake would spend the rest of his life behind bars, but Blake had no intention of accepting that fate. Inside prison, he befriended several inmates and attracted sympathy from a small group of anti-nuclear peace activists outside the prison who believed his sentence was politically excessive. Among them were Michael Randall, Pat Pottle, and Sean Burke, an Irish former prisoner with remarkable determination and technical ingenuity. Sean Burke became the key figure in what would become one of Britain's most daring prison escapes. After his own release, he secretly communicated with Blake using a smuggled walkie-talkie. The tiny radio allowed them to discuss routines, guard movements, and escape timing without attracting attention. For months, they studied every weakness in the prison's security. Burke rented safe houses, gathered equipment, and rehearsed the escape repeatedly. Timing had to be perfect. A single mistake would end the operation before it began. On the evening of October 22, 1966, Blake made his move. During recreation, he slipped toward a section of the prison wall that offered his only realistic chance. Hidden outside, Burke waited with a rope ladder designed to hook over the towering barrier. Blake climbed rapidly despite injuries sustained during the descent. Dropping from the wall left him with a damaged wrist, but adrenaline pushed him onward. Within moments, he disappeared into nearby streets before guards fully realized what had happened. The discovery sent shockwaves through the prison. Sirens sounded as officers searched every corridor. Roadblocks spread across London while police launched an enormous manhunt. Newspapers exploded with headlines questioning how Britain's most notorious spy had escaped from one of its most secure prisons. Meanwhile, Blake remained hidden in a series of carefully prepared safe houses. His rescuers constantly moved him between locations, avoiding surveillance and minimizing the risk of discovery. Every passing day increased embarrassment for British authorities while boosting Soviet morale. The final stage of the operation required extraordinary nerve. Hidden inside a specially modified camper van driven by Michael Randall and his family, Blake quietly crossed continental Europe. Border inspections were tense moments, but officials never discovered the fugitive concealed within the vehicle. Eventually, Blake reached East Germany, where Soviet agents took control of the operation. From there, he traveled safely to Moscow. Instead of living as a disgraced prisoner, he was welcomed as a hero. The Soviet government awarded him honors, a comfortable apartment, and a respected position, celebrating the man who had delivered some of the West's greatest intelligence secrets. In Britain, outrage continued for years. Questions filled Parliament. Security procedures were reviewed. Prison systems were strengthened. Intelligence agencies reassessed how they handled trusted insiders, realizing that loyalty could not always be measured by background checks or professional reputation. Remarkably, Blake never expressed regret for spying. He insisted that he had acted according to his beliefs rather than for money or personal revenge. To many in Britain, he remained a traitor responsible for catastrophic damage. To Soviet officials, he was a principled ideological warrior who had served a greater cause. Sean Burke, Michael Randall, and Pat Pottle eventually admitted their roles in helping Blake escape. Their actions sparked fierce public debate about conscience, justice, and political conviction. While controversial, their openness added another extraordinary chapter to an already astonishing story. George Blake lived in Moscow for decades after his escape, writing books, giving interviews, and watching the Cold War eventually come to an end. The Soviet Union itself collapsed, yet Blake remained committed to the ideology that had transformed his life decades earlier in a North Korean prison camp. His escape remains one of the boldest prison breaks in British history, not because it relied on violence or overwhelming force, but because it combined patience, careful planning, loyal accomplices, and Cold War deception. The prison designed to hold Britain's most dangerous spy failed against determination, ingenuity, and meticulous preparation. In the end, the greatest irony was impossible to ignore. Britain had trusted George Blake with its deepest secrets. When that trust was broken, it built walls thick enough to keep him locked away for 42 years. Yet those walls proved easier to escape than the invisible battle of ideas that had turned one of Britain's own intelligence officers into one of the Soviet Union's greatest spies.